Welcome back. Picture a narrow street in Rome just before dawn, in the spring of the year 64. The air smells of wood smoke, baked bread, and the sour tang of the Tiber. A young man is already awake, has been for an hour, filling clay jars at a public fountain while the rest of the city sleeps. He does not own the clothes on his back. He does not own his own name, not really, not the one he was born with. In a matter of months, the very city around him will be reduced to ash, and his fate, like that of hundreds of thousands of others, will hang on decisions made by men who see him as property rather than a person. Using AI recreated imagery, archaeological reconstructions, and surviving Roman paintings, we are going to walk through his world exactly as it looked and sounded and smelled, moving room by room, street by street, through the life of an enslaved person in Rome at the height of the empire. And by the end, you will also see exactly what remains of these places today, still standing beneath the modern city. To understand this moment, you have to go back further, to the earlier centuries of Rome, when slavery was smaller in scale and closer to the soil. In the earliest Roman Republic, enslaved people were often war captives absorbed into households that were themselves modest, farming families working small plots along the hills above the Tiber. There was no vast empire yet, no endless supply chain of conquered peoples. A household might have one or two enslaved workers, treated, in theory, almost as extended family, laboring beside the family that owned them. Nobody living in those early centuries could have imagined what Rome would become, or how deeply the institution of slavery would grow to define nearly every layer of its economy, its architecture, and its daily rhythm. The wars of conquest that followed against the Samnites, the Carthaginians, the Greeks, and dozens of other peoples changed everything. Each victory sent tens of thousands of new captives flooding into Roman markets. By the time you reach the reign of Nero in the year 64, slavery is no longer a household arrangement. It is the engine of an empire. Standing in Rome at its height, you would have seen a city built, quite literally, by enslaved hands. Historians estimate that by the mid-1st century, enslaved people made up somewhere between 30 and 40% of the population of Italy, and in the city of Rome itself, the number of enslaved residents likely exceeded 1/3 people. The Forum, with its gleaming marble facades and towering temples, the aqueducts stretching for dozens of miles to bring fresh water into the city, the roads paved with fitted stone. All of it depended on forced labor at some stage of construction or maintenance. You would have heard the ring of chisels on stone from sunrise, smelled hot pitch being applied to rooftops, watched teams of men hauling travertine blocks on wooden rollers through streets barely wide enough for 2 carts to pass. Nothing in this city was ever finished. Even as Nero's architects planned new building projects, older structures were constantly being patched, reinforced, or torn down and rebuilt, a permanent state of construction that meant a permanent demand for labor, most of it unfree. The civic and religious heart of Rome ran on the same foundation. The temples along the Capitoline Hill, dedicated to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, were staffed in part by enslaved attendants who cleaned the sacred spaces, prepared animals for sacrifice, and maintained the eternal flame tended by the Vestal virgins nearby. Roman law itself acknowledged enslaved people only as property, yet religious practice occasionally blurred that line, allowing enslaved individuals to participate in certain festivals, such as the December festival of Saturnalia, when social roles were briefly, symbolically inverted, and masters were expected to serve their own household slaves at the table for a single day. It was a release valve, not a reform, but it reveals how deeply Romans understood, even as they built a slave economy, that the people beneath them were fully aware of their own condition. Walk the streets of Rome on an ordinary afternoon in 64, and you would find the enslaved population everywhere, doing everything. In wealthy households, enslaved cooks prepared elaborate meals of dormice glazed in honey, fish sauce imported from Spain, and bread baked fresh each morning. In the streets, enslaved barbers shaved customers on street corners, enslaved litter bearers carried the wealthy through crowded alleys, and enslaved teachers, many of them Greek and highly educated, tutored the children of senators in rhetoric and philosophy. Not all enslaved people lived the same life. Some, especially those with specialized skills, could earn a small personal fund known as a peculium, money that was technically still their master's property but that they could use, save, and sometimes eventually use to purchase their own freedom. Others worked in far harsher conditions, particularly those sent to labor in mines or on rural estates, where treatment was brutal and life expectancy short. graffiti scratched into plaster walls throughout the city, insults, love notes, jokes, and complaints, gives us a rare, unfiltered glimpse into this crowded, noisy world, where the smell of unwashed bodies, animal dung, cooking oil, and incense all mixed together in streets that could hold as many as 100 people per acre in some districts, among the most densely packed urban environments in the ancient world. One place captured this crowded energy better than almost any other: the Circus Maximus, the great chariot racing stadium nestled in the valley between the Palatine and Aventine hills. By Nero's reign, it could hold an estimated 150,000 spectators, freeborn and enslaved alike sitting, if not beside each other, then at least within the same roaring crowd. Chariot races were dangerous and wildly popular, and successful charioteers, some of whom began as enslaved men, could earn enough prize money to purchase their own freedom and even achieve genuine celebrity status afterward. The circus was one of the few places in Roman life where the ordinary hierarchy briefly dissolved into shared spectacle, everyone screaming for the same team, the reds, the blues, the greens, or the whites, as chariots thundered around the central spine of the track at speeds that could reach nearly 40 miles an hour. Contrast that shared roar with the quiet, curated luxury of an elite household, such as the sprawling villa complexes rising on the slopes above the city, decorated with frescoes of imagined gardens, imported marble columns, and mosaic floors depicting scenes from Greek mythology. Here, enslaved domestic staff moved almost invisibly through painted corridors, trained specifically not to be noticed, dressed to complement the household's aesthetic, sometimes chosen and priced according to their appearance the way one might select furniture. Wealthy Romans commissioned portraits of themselves surrounded by attentive, silent staff, a visual statement of status as much as any marble bust. And yet, whatever comfort surrounded these households, whatever art hung on the walls, none of it would offer protection from what was coming. Fire did not distinguish between marble and mud brick, and neither did what followed it. On the night of July 18th in the year 64, a fire broke out near the Circus Maximus, likely starting among shops selling flammable goods, oil, wood, and cloth, packed tightly against the base of the stadium. What began as a contained blaze escalated within hours into an inferno that Roman writers described as unlike anything the city had witnessed. Fed by a summer wind and by narrow streets lined with wooden balconies and closely packed insulae, the multi-story apartment blocks where most ordinary Romans, free and enslaved, actually lived, the fire moved with terrifying speed, in places advancing through entire neighborhoods within a single hour. Ancient sources describe flames visible for miles, embers carried on the wind to ignite buildings far from the original source, and a heat so intense it is believed to have exceeded temperatures capable of melting bronze fittings and cracking marble. The fire burned, with brief periods of apparent containment, for roughly 6 days, and then flared again for several more, ultimately consuming an estimated 70% of the city in some form, destroying 3 of Rome's 14 districts entirely and severely damaging 7 others. In the moment, most residents likely believed they were witnessing an accidental, if catastrophic, urban fire, the kind that periodically swept through ancient cities built largely of timber. Only afterward would suspicion, rumor, and eventually historical tradition attach darker motives to the disaster, with later writers alleging, though modern historians remain divided on the reliability of these claims, that the Emperor Nero himself may have used the devastation as an opportunity to redesign the city center for his own ambitious building projects. For the enslaved population of Rome, the fire was catastrophe layered upon existing precarity. Many lived in the most flammable, poorly maintained housing, the insulae most likely to collapse or ignite first, and had the least resources or freedom of movement to flee quickly. In the chaotic weeks that followed, blame needed to be assigned, and it is widely believed, based on the historical record, that the emerging Christian community in Rome became a convenient target for public accusation and brutal punishment, illustrating how thoroughly Roman society was willing to use vulnerable groups as instruments of political convenience during a crisis. Rebuilding began almost immediately, with Nero introducing new building codes requiring wider streets, height restrictions, and fire-resistant materials, a genuine improvement in urban planning purchased at extraordinary human cost. The labor of reconstruction, unsurprisingly, fell once again largely to enslaved workers, clearing rubble, hauling new stone, and raising a rebuilt city from the ashes of the old one. In the centuries that followed the fire, Much of what had been rebuilt was itself eventually abandoned, buried, or repurposed as the Western Roman Empire declined and the population of the city shrank dramatically. Streets that had once held over 1 million residents fell nearly silent, grazed by livestock among crumbling monuments. Later builders quarried the old ruins for stone, and the specific individual stories of enslaved Romans, the litter bearers, the tutors, the fountain workers, faded almost entirely from the written record, remembered only in scattered legal texts, tombstones, and the occasional preserved letter. It would take many centuries, and the systematic archaeological work beginning in earnest in the 18th and 19th centuries, and continuing today with far more sophisticated tools, for historians to reconstruct this world in real detail. Excavations beneath modern Rome, along with sites elsewhere in the empire such as Pompeii, have uncovered enslaved workers' quarters, cramped sleeping alcoves, iron shackles, and everyday tools that put physical, tangible weight behind what ancient texts describe only abstractly. Isotope analysis of skeletal remains has even allowed researchers to trace the geographic origins of some enslaved individuals, confirming the vast, forced migration that fed Rome's labor economy from every corner of the known world. It is worth pausing here simply to remember that behind every statistic, the third of a million, the 70% of a city burned, there were individual people with names, families, and private hopes, most of which history never recorded. They were not background figures in someone else's story. They built the world we still walk through, brick by brick, without ever fully owning a single piece of it themselves. Walk through Rome today and you can still trace nearly every location from this story. The Circus Maximus survives as a long, grassy public park, its ancient seating largely gone but its unmistakable oval shape still carved into the landscape, visited by millions who now jog and picnic where chariots once thundered. The Forum's temples stand in fragments, their columns and foundations preserved as one of the world's most visited archaeological sites, with informational plaques increasingly acknowledging the enslaved labor behind their construction. Beneath the modern streets, ongoing excavations continue to reveal traces of the insulae that burned in '64, along with soot layers in the archaeological strata that geologists and archaeologists have directly linked to Tacitus's ancient account of the Great Fire. And in museums across Rome and beyond, humble everyday objects, a child's toy, a worker's tool, a simple clay lamp, sit in glass cases, quiet, physical reminders that ordinary lives filled every corner of this extraordinary, brutal, unforgettable city. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. If there is a place, a person, or a moment in history you would love to see brought back to life like this, drop it in the comments below. I genuinely read every one of them, and I will see you very soon for the next journey back in time.